We started last week a series in the book of John. And just for a little recap, we looked at an overview of the entire book. And we kind of drew this diagram, which will appear on the screen, where it looks at kind of three main parts of John's gospel. You've got the intro, and then in the middle, the death of Lazarus, and then at the end, an outro. But the beginning half is split into Jesus confronting four main institutions. He's confronting weddings and temples and rabbis and sacred wells. And then he confronts four festivals, major ones, Sabbath, Passover, tents, and Hanukkah. Then we get to the death of Lazarus, one of his friends, that leads him closer to Jerusalem. We have the episode of him washing feet. And then we have Jesus' longest discourse in any gospel, about 3 chapters in entirety, where he's praying, he's asking that the Holy Spirit may come, he's kind of fleshing out what that even means. And then we get to his death, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and then outro. And today we're going to look at John 2. But just to mention a couple of things that we didn't mention last week. One of the main reasons why we're doing this, because my dream is that whether you are new to church today or you've been going to church for your entire life, I want us to have a newfound passion for the Bible. And for all kinds of reasons. One, it's a great book. It's like salad, it's good for you. But also, I think there's so much more that we can uncover about what we are as people in and around our world, how God sees us, how we see God. And I think the appetite for Scripture has come to an all-time low in our time. And even myself, I'm guilty of this. Someone walked into church even today carrying a thick old book. And I immediately assumed it was War and Peace by Dostoevsky. Rather, it is Dostoevsky. Is it War and Peace? Just nod. Yeah, bro. It's not. Who is it? Tolstoy, of course it is. The other, yeah, brilliant. But it wasn't. It was someone's well-thumbed Bible. And so John chapter 1, we saw last week, we looked at that, that famous passage that you hear probably every Christmas if you go to church. The Word became flesh, made his dwelling amongst us, and what that means. But then straight after that, we then have John talking about this other guy called John, not the one who wrote it, but a different John, quite a common name in Jesus' time. And this John would gather people, disciples they called them, who and try and ready them for the coming of the Messiah. And as we know, he lived in the wilderness wearing dodgy clothes and eating weird food, but he was calling people, saying that there is going to come a one, and it's not me, but someone else, who is the Messiah, the long-awaited one, the one who's going to liberate us from the hand of the Romans, going to liberate us out into the promised land that we've always been waiting for. But then what happens is we find Jesus, he meets a guy called Andrew, and Andrew's immediate response is to find his brother and bring him to Jesus. His brother called Simon, he says, Simon, you've got to meet this guy. And then Jesus meets him and gives him a new name and says, from now on, I'm going to call you Peter, which must be a really irritating thing, right? Can you imagine the first time you met someone and said, I'm not going to call you Alex, I'm going to call you Jeffrey from now on. You're going to be called Jeffrey. But obviously, it means the rock. And then what happens is he then meets another guy called Philip. And Philip, his initial response is all he can possibly do is grab another friend of his and say, you've got to meet Jesus. And Jesus knows this guy, and this guy's called Nathaniel, and he calls him out. And Nathaniel's like, how do you even know me? And so what we have is these 3 episodes with John and all his mates bringing them to meet Jesus. And we've got Andrew bringing Peter, and then Philip calling Nathaniel. And what we're being told right from the day one is there is no other logical or sense-filled response to encountering the love of God other than telling your mates about him. Now, if you think about it, if the grace is as amazing as we sing about, if the love that we feel poured out upon us is so great and life-changing and cosmos-altering and life-shattering and earth-changing, then it only makes sense for us to tell others, right? I didn't grow up going to church at all. And when I became a Christian, I remember being really angry because I started to find out that teachers, I would see them at church, and I'd be like, what, you're a Christian too? And I'd see other mates from school, and I'd be like, you're a Christian too? But you never told me. I was like, so you knew all along, you've been going to this weekly gathering of lovely people, praying for each other, encouraging each other, all along, and you've kept it secret. You've had this book that tells loads of things about how my life and my identity and my purpose could be found, and you've kept it a secret. You've got this main line to Jesus where you're praying and you're able to speak to God and communicate with God, and you've kept it a secret. You're even praying to be filled with the Spirit of God. You're speaking in angelic voices. You're prophesying over each other, and you've kept it a secret from me. The only sensible and logical response we can have when meeting Jesus is to tell others about it. And remember, these guys hadn't even seen Jesus do anything cool yet. Jesus hadn't walked on water. They were merely calling people on a hunch. And yet we're like, I'll tell my best mate who doesn't know Jesus when Jesus seriously delivers. Do you know what I mean? When he drops those bags in my bank account, that's when I'm going to tell my mates about Jesus. Or when he finally delivers, when he finally lives up to the expectation, that's when I'll tell my mates. And these guys were like, we've just got this hunch that this guy could be the Messiah. I'm going to be my mates because what if he is? Their whole lives could be different. And so then we come on to John chapter 2. And again, one of the things that we said last week is St. Augustine said that the book of John is deep enough for an elephant to swim, but shallow enough that a child won't drown. So it has these kind of different levels that you can kind of casually walk through the book of John and find out about the love of God, be baptized, be a Christian. Great, amazing. But you can also read the book of John over and over and over again and still find some stuff. And the problem is I had when I was planning this is I've got two very well-known stories. You've got the wedding at Cana, which if anyone's been to a wedding before, probably a reading happened about that wedding, or was at least referred to by the person doing the wedding. And then you have the cleansing of the temple, which is where Jesus gets really angry. And it's quite fun. And we'll get into that in a minute. But these two stories happen in John 2. And so I was like, well, I could do a talk about the wedding at Cana, or I could do a talk about the cleansing of the temple. But then I was asking the question to God, why are these two stories side by side? And here's trick one when engaging with Scripture. If you think there is a question that it's asking of you, just stop and reflect and think about it. Because if you're brought up with a Western mindset, then quite often we read books to gain knowledge, or we read books to get clever, or we read books to know more stuff. And yet so often Eastern literature is written so that it asks questions of you. So it's asking a deeper question of you, the reader. It's not just giving you information that you can then recite and say, oh, well, I'm a Christian because I knew how many wives so-and-so had. But it's asking you questions. And when you find something that's slightly odd or slightly weird or juxtaposed or something that's slightly strange, just stop and think. And so what I did is I printed out the two stories, the wedding at Cana and the cleansing of the temple, and I put them side by side. And I was like, God, why are these stories next to each other? And I found 10 parallels. Don't worry, that's not 10 points. Don't worry, you're not going to have to remember it. But 10 parallels where these stories, in chronological order, follow a certain pattern. And I think God is trying to say something to us tonight through it. And I think the writer John was trying to do something here that's a bit more than just writing two stories and putting them next to each other. Are you ready? Bro, if you've got a Bible, it might be handy to get it out or Google it quickly or get War and Peace out if you've got that instead and just underline that. But I love to highlight things in my Bible. I love to write it out. So I've got those Gospels available just in case you want to scribble through it, write it out and all that stuff. But if not, just keep notes on your phone. That's cool too. So the first thing we have in John chapter 2 of these two parallels, imagine that side by side, is for both of these stories, we're told immediately what kind of occasion we have. So John 2 verse 1, on the third day, a wedding took place. We need to stop there. Whenever we have these kind of incidences, festivals, or occasions, stop there. We're being told by the writer, this isn't just a normal Tuesday afternoon. This isn't just a normal day of the week. There's something significant happening here. And then again, later on in John 2, we hear this in verse 13, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover. Again, we've got to stop. This isn't just a normal bank holiday afternoon. There's something significant the writer's trying to tell us about these two occasions. So a wedding. A wedding in the time of Jesus was not like weddings in the UK. So when you get a wedding invite in the UK, you probably go, do I have the right dress? Do I really like them? Are they the kind of people that are going to do nice food, bougie food, good food, rubbish food? Is it going to be chicken wrapped in Parma ham again? Or is it going to be like a bougie little food van outside? Do they have a John Lewis gift list? Or do they just have a, please donate to our honeymoon fund? Like, what kind of people is it? Are they really good friends? Are they really rubbish friends? Like, how am I going to accept this invite? Now, this is not the kind of wedding in Jesus' time. And if you're not from the West and from the Northern Hemisphere, you probably understand this. This is like a community affair whereby even if you're invited, you're never going to turn down the invite. You're going to rock up and you're going to take food and you're going to be part of the festival. And it's not just going to be one day. It might be 3 or 5 or 7 days of celebrating what's going on here. Now, why that? Well, because for a Jew in the time of Jesus, a wedding meant so much more than just two people falling in love and saying we're going to live together for the rest of our life. A wedding was a symbol, a prophetic act saying that we worship the God who is wedded to his people. And in this act, we are reflecting something of the very heart of God. Therefore, when we come together and celebrate this, we're celebrating a God who is still alive. And we lose that sometimes in our weddings full of like flowers and balloons and stuff like that. And so the wedding's incredibly significant, but incredibly local. If you put that in parallel with what's going on at the cleansing of the temple, we have the Passover. Passover was that festival we talked about a bit last week. Passover was a festival once a year where Jews got together in Jerusalem to celebrate the moment where God spared his people and said, I'm going to help you flee the Egyptians through the Red Sea into the Promised Land. And do you remember they painted it over the door frames, the blood of the Lamb. And the angel of death passed over God's people, and so they were able to be free. And they worship once a year, they get together and celebrate God sparing the people of Israel and being able to send them on their way into the Promised Land. Incredibly national and any Jew invited. It is much more diverse, a group of people meeting for Passover than just your wedding. So there's two things, we've got two occasions. And then we're told about the locations of these things. So on the third day, a wedding took place in Cana, at Cana in Galilee. And then in the cleansing of the temple, we hear, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And again, we've got to stop there. We're not just talking, why not Ormskirk or Sefton, or like what is significant about these places? Well, when we read Cana of Galilee, we should think about certain things. Now, one, it's in the countryside, so it's not the cosmopolitan area of the city. But also in the countryside, Cana of Galilee was like in the middle of a trade route, which meant that people who lived in Cana of Galilee were incredibly savvy to the thinking of all over the world. So they have Greeks going through, Parthians going through, Edomites going through, all kinds of different people going through with different worldviews, different cultures. And the people who lived in Galilee were absorbing all of this stuff, knowing all this kind of different worldview and stuff. And when we hear of Jerusalem, we should hear of like the religious capital of the world at the time. The place where people go to gather to worship, if you think of words like orthodox and right and correct and polite and like all that stuff is tangled up with the place of Jerusalem. It became a place where people would imagine God's dwelling being. Like they would know that God's dwelling place was in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, in Jerusalem. So you go to Jerusalem to encounter God, but you better make sure that you've got everything in check before you meet with God. There's this process that's going on. And then we're told in both stories how Jesus got there. So in John 2, verse 3, it says this. John 2, verse 2, sorry. And Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. And yet what we know about the cleansing of the temple is we're just told this. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Two different ways of Jesus moving. And they're incredibly significant. Because there are two different ways, I think, we can engage with Jesus. We either invite him or he goes there. And I think there's two different responses when Jesus rocks up in your life. If you've invited him, there's a different disposition, isn't there? Or where Jesus has to charge in your life and smash it to pieces. Now, I was definitely of the latter. I wasn't seeking God in any way that I kind of imagined. I didn't grow up kind of on this this godlike quest where I was looking for the deistic right in my life at all. I was minding my own business in a pub age 15, and a guy came in selling illegal DVDs, and I bought The Passion of the Christ off him for $5, thinking it was going to be like The Gladiator or some of those historical epic films, and I watched it and absolutely fell in love with the person of Jesus. And it changed everything. It messed up my family relationships because my family don't know Jesus, and I started to see where there was difficulties and tensions and all that kind of thing. It started to ruin some of my friendships because my mates who were doing certain things, I couldn't necessarily enter into the same things as them, and they thought that divide was enough to not want to be friends with me anymore. It started to ruin my vision for my life. I was going to go and serve in the army. I had a place at officer training college, and I called up the officer training the recruitment officer and said, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to turn on my place because I don't know how I'd answer the call to shoot someone. And he was like, we've got loads of Christians in the army. I was like, yeah, but I'm like a baby Christian. I don't have any of that clever nous around how I can deal with the ethics of killing someone. And he was like, yeah, right, mate, whatever. But it ruined my life, completely ruined my life. So how Jesus got there, he was invited by those at the wedding, but there was a reason why he went to Jerusalem. And this little phrase, Jesus went to Jerusalem, is the same phrase that we find out in the woman at the well later on, where it says he just had to go through Samaria. There's a drive behind what he's doing. It's not like he's ambling around thinking, what should I do today? But he went there. There was a drive and a purpose for Jesus going to Jerusalem. And then we're told in both the stories who was there. At the wedding at Cana in Galilee, we're told Jesus' mother was there and his disciples were there because they had also received an invitation. They were there in obedience, if you like. But then we're told in the story at Jesus clearing the temple is that there were those selling animals and money changers. And some of us might be thinking, well, what's the big deal? Because what was happening is people were flocking to Jerusalem for Passover, to celebrate Passover, when it'd be right to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. And you can sacrifice anything to God. I mean, there's some things you can't sacrifice, but the offering of animals by which you can sacrifice is quite vast, from pigeons to doves to cattle to goats, kind of anything you like. And what people were doing is, because people were traveling such a long way, they're like, rather than pick up a goat on your way while you're riding a horse to Jerusalem, we'll provide the goat if you provide the funds. And so people would come with any kind of currency and they'd bring it into the temple and they'd buy a goat off a mate and then they would change that money into the currency of Jerusalem. And then they'd be able to offer that goat. And some of us might be thinking, well, surely that's just helping people out. It's just, making worship accessible. And we here at Penny Lane talk about we want all people to feel welcome and surely they're just doing that. But Jesus has an issue with it. Jesus has an issue with it and we're going to get to it in just a moment. And so then after that, in both the stories, we're told what the problem is. There's a big problem at the wedding at Cana in Galilee. It says this, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Now, why is that an issue? Well, in the culture of Jesus' time, shame was a huge thing. And they weren't just concerned about wine because they wanted to have an absolute slosh fest. They were concerned about wine because wine was the way that you made water able to be drunk by most people. And we're not talking about like a 15% Cabernet Sauvignon. We're just talking about wine that is easy to drink so that people can be refreshed and people can stay for longer at the party. And if you ran out of wine, it meant that people would have to go home and find alternative drinking sources elsewhere, which means the party would stop, which means that the bridegroom would often take a bit of flack from all kinds of people for not being able to provide all that was needed. And again, there's an issue here that Jesus is confronted with. And similarly, in the later story, we're confronted with the idea that this whole temple worship system is failing. That Jesus has an issue with this temple worship system because what's happening? People are coming to worship God, pick up their sacrifice. There we go, I've paid my money, had the thing slaughtered. I'm off home now because all my sins are forgiven. Isn't that great? And sometimes I think we can be like that a bit with church, can't we? As long as we get to church, tick that box, go home, everything's fine. As long as we can go to home group, tick that box, go. As long as we listen to the Bible in 1 year, get that out, tick that box, fine. And yet Jesus is always after the heart. He's always after the heart. Which is why that widow's mite of just 2 coins is worth way more than people giving exuberant acts of financial worship. It's all about the heart. It's like if you want to come to worship, come to worship. Don't worry about paying to find the thing. And the problem is with the system as well, is it massively benefited those that are wealthy, but what are those with no money? They would come to worship. They want to be clear with God. They want to make sure that any divide between them and God is gone. But if you can't afford the worship, what good are you in this system? And so Jesus has an issue. He wants the worship of man to be pure and one to be heart-driven. And so then in both stories, we have the response. So Jesus' mum has come to him and said, they have no more wine. Dear woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. If you're a mother in the house and your child ever says, dear woman to you, I'm sure you would, anyone tried it with their mum? My mum is not someone that you could ever say dear woman to without receiving a bit of a backhand. What's Jesus doing here? Is he just being harsh? And again, when we get to these bits in the Bible, we should just stop and go, this is weird. Because it's not meant to be like, okay, we'll breeze through it. We're used to Jesus saying a bit odd stuff. What's he saying here? What he's saying here is he's recalibrating and saying that in the economy of God, people with closer proximity to Jesus don't get preferential treatment. Like just because you know Jesus, just because you're close to Jesus, just because you've been hanging out with Jesus all his life, does not mean that your requests are any more significant than those who have just rocked up and just met him. Just because you think you're a card-carrying, Bible-believing member of the Jesus Club, it doesn't mean we have preferential treatment to Jesus other than that person lying on the street who's never known Jesus before. And so he's recalibrating and saying, amongst us all, I have no mother or father. Amongst us all, I have no one closer. And we see this later on in the gospel where he's presented with his mother and brother, and he says, my mother and brothers are those who are here. And this is incredibly good news for those who have dysfunctional families. Incredibly good news. And again, when I first became a Christian, one of the best things about joining the church was that I had a whole new load of cousins and brothers and sisters and uncles and aunties. And when I look at my kids and them growing up in this church specifically, I'm like, they've got a load of church cousins and church uncles and aunties that know them better than their biological uncles and aunties do, that know them better than their biological cousins do, but they're going to be the ones praying for them, encouraging them, raising them up in faith, worshiping on their behalf when they're too tired to worship, being with them through the thick and thin of teenage life and going off to work and all that stuff. It's the family of God that's going to be upholding these people. Incredibly good news. And it reminds me of that psalm that says, God sets the lonely into families. Incredibly good news for people when our biological families are broken and messed up. So Jesus' first response to the wine, he appears not to act. He's like, my time has not yet come. Going to sit back, going to chill. How different his response when he sees the state of temple worship. What happens after he sees it? It says this, so he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, get these out of here. How dare you turn my father's house into a market? Again, we've got to stop here because this isn't like nice and fluffy Jesus hanging out with sheep and patting children on the head. We've got to stop here when we get to these points in scriptures and be like, what is happening? What is going on here? Because I think sometimes we read these stories so quickly and we just gloss over them and we forget the detail that's going in. Here we're being told that Jesus Christ, Son of God, the long-awaited Messiah, Son of Man, is sitting on the floor fashioning a whip out of cords. It hasn't said he just picked one up. It says he made it, which takes a lot of method and logic, to go around, is this the right kind of rope for that? Yeah, maybe that piece and that piece, and then sitting on the temple steps, thinking about what he's doing. You can't just fashion a whip randomly, can you? It takes some kind of skill. So what's going on here? Why is Jesus so angry that he's going to almost enact an act of violence towards what's going on here? Well, I think for Jesus, it's an act of, he sees an act of injustice. He sees an act of injustice that's made an inequality for those who are poor, for those who don't know God, and they've created in the temple a system by which it prefers those who are wealthy, and it prefers those who know the system. And Jesus comes and he confronts that temple system and says, this is not going to be a place like that. This is going to be a place where whether you have money or no money, whether you know God or don't, there's going to be an opportunity for you to encounter God. And so he gets really mad. And I think it's one of the main issues that Jesus gets, all throughout the Gospels, we see this theme come up and again. When people have created a system by which the holy feel holier and the sinners feel more sinful. And yet he comes in and he confronts it. And he charges it out, whips the injustice out of the building. And again, this is incredibly good news. Incredibly good news that our God, the King of Kings, acts like this in matters of injustice. Incredibly good news if you're a refugee that we worship a God who doesn't just sit back, but he gets down and dirty, fashions a whip, and drives injustice out of the temple. Incredibly good news if you're locked in poverty that our God is a God who fashions a whip and whips injustice out of the building. Incredibly good news if you are lonely or widowed or orphaned that our God is a God who doesn't just sit by passively, but instead fashions a whip of cords and drives injustice out of the building and says no more is God's house going to be a place where people make money, where people just produce stuff? But it's going to be a place where people are set free and people are going to encounter God. And then we have the response from both parties. So Jesus Jesus' mom has said, they have no more wine. He then says, dear woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. She hasn't even listened to him, has she? Do whatever he tells you. And she walks off because they're about to play, I don't know, candy on the DJ, I don't know, whatever happened. And then what happens? Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Again, this is meant to be weird. We're not meant to just read through that and go, well, this is weird. This is weird. Why ceremonial jars? Why ceremonial jars often used for washing? Well, already, Jesus' first miracle in John's gospel, John's pointing towards the end. John's pointing towards there's going to come a time where Jesus is going to need to be ceremonially washed. Because as he is killed upon the cross, the next thing they have to do is they have to wash his body to get it ready for burial. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. The response of the people around Jesus at the wedding at Cana is one of obedience, one of just rocking up. So they did so. They just did what he asked. The difference in the response between those at the temple is it says this, the Jews then responded to him, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? It's kind of an arms crossed. What kind of authority are you doing this? You're whipping stuff out of the building. Who's asked you? Who's your boss? What kind of authority do you have? You see the difference in the people's response to Jesus. One, they did so, and the other, standing back, demanding a sign. And then in both stories, we get a sign. Then he told them in verse 8, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. Again, they did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it came from, so that, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. This, the first of the miraculous signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. So here we have Jesus asking these people around him to fill up these jars. They take it to the master of ceremonies. He tastes the wine, and he says, this wine's amazing. This wine's even better than you brought out before. And what we have now is we have this bridegroom who was hanging around, who was worried about the lack of wine, who could have been in a place of real shame, suddenly brought to a place of honor. Jesus isn't running around saying, I did it, it was my miracle, I was pretty good at that. This guy suddenly is elevated to a place of honor, which is what the gospel is. The gospel is time and time again, Jesus rocking up into our lives where there is potential for shame, where there's potential for everyone around us to think, who are they? What mess are they filled with? The shame of sin that surrounds us, and yet Jesus restores us and brings us to a place of honor. So much so that we are called children of God, co-heirs with Christ, more than conquerors. We're brought to a place of honor. What about the sign in the temple? The Jews demanded of him, what miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and I'll raise it again in 3 days. Here we have the promise of a sign. We have a promise that at one point, Jesus talking metaphorically about the temple around himself, he said one day this is going to crumble. And it does so in 70 CE. But he's also saying that one day this temple, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit that's made his dwelling among us in the person of Jesus Christ, is the temple, is the Holy of Holies in your midst. Tear it down, and in 3 days, I'll be raised again. So again, already in John chapter 2, we've got 2 allusions, 2 forecasts of Jesus' ultimate destination of death and of resurrection. So then we have, straight after, in both stories, the disciples' reaction to both of those things. It says this is the first miraculous signs Jesus performed in Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. So immediately the disciples are like, wow, this isn't just a rumor anymore, like we thought in John chapter 1. This isn't just a hunch. Now this guy, this one I'm following, might actually be the Messiah, the one we're waiting for. I'm going to put my faith in him. The difference is, later on, after the cleansing of the temple, it says this. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So we're thinking like kind of around the time of Acts, all the disciples hanging out over a whiskey or a wine or whatever. And they're like, oh, do you remember that time we were in that temple? Yeah, what did Jesus say? Do you remember he said, like, if you tear down this temple, 3 days, that's what happened. And so suddenly their faith is raised because of recounting the story later. And then here's where the challenge comes. In both stories, we have Jesus' response to the whole thing. So it says this in verse 12. After this, after the wedding, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and there they stayed for a few days. So after all of it, after the obedience to Jesus' words, after the delivery, after the witnessing of the sign, after placing their faith in Jesus, Jesus then chooses to spend time with his mother and his brother and his disciples. He chooses to go with them and spend time with them, chooses to bless them with his company, chooses to bless them with his teaching and his wisdom, chooses to accept their hospitality, chooses to bring honor to wherever they go. And how we compare that then after the cleansing of the temple. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. The difference in that, Jesus wouldn't hang out with them. He was like, you know what? I'll do some stuff, heal some people, pray for some people, but actually this isn't going to be my crowd. I'm not going to be with the holy people of Jerusalem, because I've got a gang in the unholy, unclean place of Galilee. I've got people there that are going to reflect the heart of God far better than all the religious, upright people of the day could possibly do it. And so as I was sat in my study thinking about these two passages, it then reminded me of something from John chapter 1 that we looked at last week. John chapter 1 has these two verses side by side. Verse 12 says this, to all who did receive him, to all people who did invite him in and receive him, to those who believed in his name. So he said, you know what? This is the Messiah. This is God. This is King of Kings in flesh. To those people, he gave the right to become children of God. He hung out with them as kin. He hung out with them and spent time with them and blessed them. John 1 verse 11, he came to that which was his own, the people of Jerusalem. The special people, the holy people, the upright people, the righteous and the proper. But his own did not receive him. His own didn't acknowledge him. His own didn't take him in. His own just thought he was a miracle maker that could do gimmicky tricks. His own did not receive him. You know, there's only one other time in the entire Gospel of John where we hear that word receive. It's paralelabon in Greek. And it comes from this passage. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified, so the soldiers received Jesus. When Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified, is the only other time where we hear about Jesus being received. Now there's two options here, isn't there? Do we invite Jesus in? Do we invite Jesus in, or are we just going to wait and stand around until Jesus breaks down and barges into our life? Are we going to invite him in and receive him and be called children of God? Or are we just going to rock up to church, do the right thing, say our amens, and head out? I think the challenge comes because John is always pointing towards the end. In nearly every story, he's pointing towards the end. Not just the arrest, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus, but the end of all things as we get in the book of Revelation. Because we're told in the book of Revelation there will come a time where everyone will either invite Jesus in or he will confront them. And there's two options. Do we invite Jesus into our life? Do we allow him to speak into our life? Do we then try and obey his commands? Do we then try and be led into wholeness by him? Or are we going to be on the other side? Or are we just going to kind of do what looks right. Do what society says is proper, and just wait for Jesus to come in, barge in, and completely ruin and destruct the way that we are doing life. I want to be someone who invites Jesus in. I want to be someone who isn't just waiting on the outskirts and just hoping Jesus jumps in. But I want to be someone who, right from day one, just says, Jesus, come into my life. The beginning of every day, Jesus, come into my life. The beginning of every difficult conversation before work, Jesus, come into my life. May my life be a blessing like that filled cup. May my life be a blessing. May people be so transfixed. May people taste something of my life where they're like, well, there must be something better. There must be something better going on in your life than everyone else. There must be something deeper. There must be something that gives your life a sweetness about it. Now, it's certainly not my bank account. It's certainly not my physique. It's certainly not my good looks. What could it be? It's got to be the grace and love of Jesus that gives each one of us a power that means wherever we go, we can be like that wine in that wedding cup that fills up and continues to fills up and continue to pours out and continues to give people grace and continues to bless the people that we're around. But it starts with inviting Jesus in. It starts with inviting him in.